Ed Reed left the NFL with a legacy that very few people in the history of American sports can touch. One of the greatest free safeties of all time. The man who completely changed the way defense is understood, taught, and feared. Throughout his storied career, Ed Reed was the soul of the Baltimore Ravens defense, a cold-blooded brain capable of reading a quarterback's intentions before the ball even left his hand. He was selected to the Pro Bowl 9 times, earned first-team All-Pro 5 times, won the NFL Defensive Player of the Year award, and became a Super Bowl champion where he wasn't just a guy who finished the job, but a game-changer with a single moment. Reed holds the all-time record for interception return yards, a number that doesn't just speak to endurance, but reflects a rare predatory instinct. Catching the ball wasn't enough. He always turned it into a sentence for the opponent. Legendary coaches and the best quarterbacks of his generation all admitted the same thing. Ed Reed wasn't scary because of his size or speed, but because of his intelligence, because of his ability to see chaos before it could even form. When his name was called for the Pro Football Hall of Fame in his first year of eligibility, it wasn't favoritism. It was the cold recognition that the NFL had witnessed a rare defensive standard, one almost impossible to repeat. But right in the middle of that blinding spotlight, a painful paradox began to emerge. Because behind that perfect resume, there wasn't the sense of safety that people usually assign to victory by default. Ed Reed didn't step into post-retirement life as a man who'd completed his mission. He stepped out like a soldier who'd never been allowed to lower his weapon. For more than 30 years, he lived two parallel lives. On the field, he was an unrelenting predator, forced to make decisions ahead of everyone to protect his teammates from fatal mistakes. Off the field, he was a man always on guard, never sleeping soundly, carrying the feeling that the world had never truly been safe. Ed Reed's pain didn't come from one moment of collapse, but from the long grind of responsibility. The responsibility to be right, to see far ahead, to bear the consequences if things went off track. That will kept him standing through the collisions, the injuries, the seasons when his body begged to stop. But it also forced him to stay in defensive mode even when victory had faded into the past. And that's the opening question for this story. What made a man who reached the peak that the whole world dreams of still never allow himself to sleep easy? If you want to understand why a legend like Ed Reed has had to live in a defensive state his entire life, subscribe to the channel and hit like to keep joining us on this journey. On television, Ed Reed always appeared as a creature born to dominate chaos. Cold eyes, solid stance, every movement radiating the feeling that he knew what was coming before it even started. The cameras loved that image. A deep safety, patient, waiting, then exploding as if the whole world had just walked into the trap he'd set long ago. Fans knew Ed Reed on the field as a symbol of absolute control, a man who didn't need to talk much, but whose every action carried near ruthless certainty. But when the stadium lights went out, when the highlight reels ended, and the screen switched to something else, Ed Reed off the field was a completely different person. Not seeking attention, not liking to appear, not living off retelling what he'd done. He stepped out of that role with the same habit that had followed him for years. Vigilant, cautious, always keeping distance from the world. If on TV Ed Reed was the center of every movement, off the field he chose to stand on the sidelines, observing, listening, and rarely revealing his true thoughts. Those two images existed side by side, so opposite they seemed like they couldn't belong to the same person, yet they were tied together by an invisible thread called responsibility. Ed Reed's double life was never fake or performative. It wasn't a mask he chose to wear. It was armor, forced to form when he learned early that weakness wasn't an option. On the field, one moment of slowing down, 1 second of hesitation, one wrong decision, was enough for teammates to pay with their bodies. Off the field, Softness could drag the things he treasured most into the whirlwind of fame and scrutiny. So Ed Reed learned to live without ever fully shedding his role. No locker room was private enough for him to unload the burden of leadership. No room was quiet enough for him to temporarily forget the feeling that he always had to be responsible for the worst that could happen. The tragedy is that it wasn't a two-faced life to deceive others, but a life torn in two by the same repeated demand over 3 decades. Stay solid, stay alert, stay half a step ahead of the world. Ed Reed never had the privilege of being an ordinary person after the game ended. While others turned to family, friends, or private moments to unwind, he kept himself in defensive mode, as if life off the field was also an endless game with no final whistle. Ed Reed's pain didn't come from a collapse or public tragedy, but from the absence of a space where he was allowed to just exist without carrying any role. No one asked him how it felt to always be the one reading the game for others. No one saw the exhaustion building up in a man always forced to be right. And that very silence turned Ed Reed's double life into a permanent state, where he was both the icon on television and a man off the field who was never allowed to drop his guard. In that world, victory didn't bring release, fame didn't bring peace, and glory never meant safety. Ed Reed kept living, kept walking between those two lives, not because he wanted to, but because that was the price for never being allowed to be weak from the start. Street Rose, Louisiana, wasn't a place where people grew up with pure dreams. It was a place where people learned to open their eyes to danger earlier than learning to believe in the future. And right there in that low-lying land, Ed Reed's childhood began more as a lesson in survival than a coming-of-age story. Poverty wasn't an abstract concept in Street Rose. It was present in the rundown houses, in the roads without shoulders, in the prolonged sense of lack that became normal, where kids understood very early that not everyone got to dream for long. Violence didn't always explode into big incidents, but it hung in the air like a reminder that this world didn't forgive, that one wrong step could bring irreparable consequences. There, kids weren't taught to chase dreams. First, they were taught to avoid trouble, to read adults' eyes, to know when to stay quiet, when to back off. Ed Reed grew up in that environment, where every passing day carried an unspoken question. Is today safe? And if not, what do I have to do to survive? No one called it fear, because fear in Street Rose was part of the rhythm of life. Background noise that people got so used to, they stopped noticing it. Reed learned to observe before acting, learned to remember small details others ignored, because there, mistakes weren't forgiven with a reminder, they came with a specific, painful price. His childhood didn't have much room for innocence, because innocence was a luxury the surroundings didn't allow. Afternoons weren't for daydreaming, they were for noticing who was nearby, what was happening, if anything felt off. Reed didn't grow up feeling the world would protect him. He grew up believing the opposite. If he didn't protect himself, no one would. That feeling gradually shaped a mental state always strung tight like a wire, where the mind was never fully relaxed, where every decision was weighed as if it could be the line between safety and danger. The tragedy of this period wasn't in one specific event easy to point to, it was in the absence of things that seemed obvious. No prolonged, carefree feeling, no belief that tomorrow would naturally be better than today. Instead, it was a childhood forced to mature, where Reed learned to take responsibility for himself from a very young age, where survival became the top priority and everything else secondary, right there in Street Rose. The idea that mistakes came with consequences sank deep into him, not as a moral lesson, but as a survival reflex. Every choice carried risk. Every moment of carelessness could lead to loss. And so, Reed gradually formed the habit of never believing things would just be okay. The world, in that boy's eyes, was a place always hiding danger, and only constant alertness kept him standing. That was the root of the tragedy that would follow him his whole life. A man never allowed to experience a real childhood because from the start he was placed in the role of having to survive. What others later called pressure was, for Reed, just the continuation of a state that existed from very early on. Looking back, people easily praise his mental strength, but few realize that strength was built on a foundation of deprivation and vigilance, on a childhood where dreams always came after safety. Street. Rose didn't give Ed Reed gentle memories to carry. It gave him an instinct, a cautious way of seeing the world, and the bitter truth that survival is always the first lesson, and sometimes the only one. After those years in Street, Rose, when survival had become a reflex, Ed Reed entered a phase where the hurt no longer came only from the outside environment, but began to seep deep into the way he looked at people and the world, a quiet but relentless process of internalization. That boy learned to read eyes before he learned to trust words, because eyes don't know how to lie in decisive moments. Reed watched how adults stood close or far, how their voices changed when tense, how silence was sometimes more dangerous than any threat. In the place Reed grew up, gestures were never random. Every glance, every slowed or hurried step carried a message that, if you didn't decode it in time, the price could be very real and very painful. No one sat the boy down to teach him how to analyze people. There was no book guiding how to read danger in everyday life. It was all learned through experience, through times when he realized a mistake was never just a mistake. A mistake meant paying a price, and sometimes that price wasn't just emotional, it was your own safety. Reed gradually formed a mental habit, always scanning the space around him, always noticing the smallest changes, always questioning what wasn't being said. Silence to him wasn't peaceful emptiness. It was where the most information was hidden. When others went quiet, Reed listened harder. When a room got too still, he got more alert. That intelligence wasn't nurtured by encouragement or a safe environment. It was sharpened by fear and the need to survive. It wasn't the kind of smarts people praise in classrooms. It was the kind born from having to understand others to avoid danger. The tragedy is that when intelligence forms that way, it never gets turned off. Reed didn't learn to read people to win. He learned to survive, and that habit followed him through childhood, into his teenage years, and became the foundation for every decision that came after. In his early relationships, Reed rarely fully let his guard down, not because he lacked feeling, but because he was too used to keeping a safe distance. He understood that people could change very fast, that one moment of carelessness could turn everything upside down. That created a complex inner world, sharp yet cautious, deeply understanding others, yet rarely letting anyone get close enough. What later got called football IQ, that genius-level ability to read plays, was really honed much earlier in everyday life, where Reed read people the same way he read a dangerous situation. But along with that intelligence came a quiet, constant exhaustion, because always analyzing, always staying vigilant, meant his mind never got to rest. Reed had no memories of long, carefree days, no period where he was allowed to believe things would be okay if he didn't keep watch. Instead, it was a youth where staying alert became a duty, where seeing people as potential threats wasn't a choice. It was the only way to keep going. The biggest tragedy of this phase wasn't what happened, but what never got the chance to exist. The feeling of being nurtured in safety, of being allowed to make mistakes without paying too high a price, of growing up without carrying constant suspicion. Ed Reed's intelligence, the thing that later made the whole NFL fear him, wasn't built from care or gentle guidance. It came from fear quietly piling up over the years. And once that intelligence became his identity, Reed slowly realized he'd gone too far to ever go back to being someone who could simply trust the world around him. What that boy learned in the silence of Street, Rose never left him. It just changed shape, waiting for the day it would be called genius, while deep underneath, it was still a child who'd learned to look at people like threats, because he'd never been allowed to look at them any other way. Miami didn't enter Ed Reed's life like some shining promised land of sunshine. It came as a dark gateway, where the vigilance once formed from fear was, for the first time, given a name: value. When Reed stepped into the Miami Hurricanes program, he didn't bring naive dreams of college glory or the NFL. He brought something much heavier: the habit of never relaxing and the belief that mistakes always came with a price. Miami was the first time Reed was clearly recognized not for his muscles, not for his speed, but for his ability to see what others couldn't. On the practice field, in film rooms, he was quickly seen as an extraordinary defensive mind, someone who didn't just do his job right, but corrected others before mistakes could even happen. But that recognition didn't bring a sense of release. Instead, it felt like a quiet sentence. From now on, he wasn't allowed to be wrong. At Miami, Reed learned that his value was tied to constant alertness. Every accurate read made his teammates safer. Every correctly placed step kept the whole system running smooth. Every time he spoke up in the locker room carried weight that an average college kid never had to carry. He became the guy other defensive backs looked to for where to stand, what to do, what to avoid. The vigilance that had once been a personal survival mechanism now became a collective asset, and that very thing locked Reed tighter into his role. Miami celebrated him because he was always right, but the price of always being right was never being allowed to be tired. Reed's famous locker room speeches weren't Hollywood-style inspirational moments, not empty shouts about honor or victory. They were the raw cry of someone who understood very clearly that if he didn't stand up and take responsibility, everything could fall apart. Reed didn't speak to pump people up, he spoke to warn. He spoke like someone used to seeing danger from far away, and who couldn't stand the thought of his teammates getting hurt just because they lost focus. In that moment, Miami didn't just give Reed recognition. They gave him a mental burden he could never put down. He was no longer a young player learning. He was the one who had to keep the whole system from derailing. Ed Reed's threshold crossing wasn't stepping into the light. It was stepping deeper into the darkness of responsibility. Miami gave him a stage to show his intelligence, but it also turned that intelligence into an obligation. With every game that passed, Reed understood more clearly that his vigilance no longer belonged just to him. It was what others depended on to survive on the field. And when a person is celebrated for not being allowed to be wrong, the tragedy starts forming very quietly. Reed learned to suppress exhaustion, suppress doubt, suppress even the need to be weak, because at Miami, weakness didn't just affect him. It could spread to the whole team. He walked out of those college years with the reputation of an intellectual leader, but inside, he'd grown used to carrying the fear that if he ever missed a beat, everything would collapse with him. Miami didn't create Ed Reed, but Miami legitimized the person he'd been forced to become from very early on. A man always half a step ahead of danger. A man loved for his ability to protect others, and also a man growing farther and farther from the ability to protect himself. The NFL didn't welcome Ed Reed like some complete dream. It opened up in front of him like a battlefield, where every mistake took on a concrete shape, and the price was always paid with human bodies. Reed stepped into this league with an awareness that had been ingrained in him from very early on. But now, it became more ruthless than ever. If I read it wrong, someone else gets hurt. At this highest level, there was no room for slow adjustments or educational forgiveness. Every misread route, every half-a-beat late backpedal could send a teammate crashing helmet first into an opponent at full speed, could snap a knee, could send a career veering in a different direction. Reed understood that right from the first practices, when the game's speed was so fast that thinking had to outrun the body, when space collapsed in a blink and every decision had to be made before the brain could even weigh fatigue, The pressure in the NFL wasn't like anything he'd ever experienced. It didn't just come from coaches, from the media, or from fan expectations. It came from a crushing sense of responsibility that didn't allow him to let his guard down for even 1 second. Reed wasn't allowed to be tired. Tired meant slow. Slow meant wrong. And wrong meant someone else paid the price. So he learned to hide exhaustion the way you'd hide a wound that wasn't allowed to show. He learned to cut himself off from distractions off the field, not because of imposed discipline, but because distraction was a form of danger he wouldn't permit to exist. As the seasons passed, Reed gradually became one of the most feared defensive minds in the league. But at the same time, the quiet fear grew with every play. The fear wasn't of public failure. It was the silent fear that if one day he couldn't read the game like he used to, the consequences wouldn't just belong to him. Reed's success in the NFL was tied tightly to that constant state of tension. Every interception, every time he appeared in the perfect spot to break up a pass, brought a brief release, then was immediately replaced by the next question: what about next time? There was no accumulating sense of safety. No moment allowed him to think he'd been good enough to relax. Reed lived in a chain of continuous present moments, where the past wasn't allowed to comfort him and the future always carried risk. He didn't step onto the field with the simple joy of the game. He stepped on with the heavy awareness of someone who knew his role was the last line of defense, where every error was laid bare. Ed Reed's professional tragedy began there, not in a lack of success, but in the fact that that success was built on a foundation of fear that never left. The better he got, the more tightly he was bound to the expectation that he had to be perfect every time. The more trusted he became, the less space he had to be an ordinary human with natural limits. The NFL turned Reed's intelligence into a weapon, but at the same time turned it into a burden. Every game that ended didn't bring a sense of completion. It just meant surviving one more time. Reed left the field with an aching body, but his mind kept running, analyzing, rewinding moments that could have gone differently if he'd been half a beat slower. In that world, success wasn't a destination. It was a fragile state that had to be guarded non-stop. And that very thing made Ed Reed's NFL career both brilliant and dark, where the spotlight always came with the shadow of constant fear, where every step forward was paid for by never allowing himself to stop. The Baltimore Ravens weren't just the team. Ed Reed wore the jersey for the longest. They were the place where his power took shape, was reinforced, and at the same time became the invisible cage that held him in solitude. When Reed truly stepped into the heart of the Ravens' defense, he was no longer just an outstanding individual player. He became a true defensive quarterback, the one who controlled an entire life-or-death system with his intelligence and instinct. On the field, Reed didn't need to shout much, didn't need flashy gestures. A single glance, a small hand signal, and the whole defense adjusted to him instantly. Every eye turned to Reed before each play, not because they doubted, but because they had absolute trust that he saw what they hadn't yet noticed. That trust gave Reed a rare kind of power, but it came with a mental burden no one could share. Reed's power didn't bring a comfortable sense of dominance. It brought the heavy responsibility of someone who knew that if he got it wrong, everyone paid. In Baltimore, Reed became the final line of defense not just tactically, but mentally. Teammates played with more confidence knowing Reed was behind them. Coaches slept easier knowing Reed read the game. And the whole city of Baltimore placed its faith in him as an invisible pillar. But in all of that, there was no one standing behind Ed Reed to carry the fear for him. No one said that today he was allowed to slow down, allowed to be tired, allowed to doubt himself. Reed understood his role very clearly. Others could make mistakes and be covered for. He could not. Leading in silence became Reed's identity, but it was also his tragedy. He didn't yell in the locker room like an emotional leader. He didn't seek recognition through words. Reed led by presence and by always being in the right spot. That's why when everything ran smoothly, people took it for granted. But when cracks threatened, all eyes turned straight to him. The Baltimore Ravens built their defense around Ed Reed's intelligence, and that made him both celebrated and isolated. Reed had no right to collapse, no right to let emotion show, because if he wavered even slightly, the whole system would shake. Those peak years with the Ravens weren't a string of days enjoying success. They were a string of days maintaining constant vigilance. Reed stepped onto the field every Sunday, knowing he wasn't just playing for himself, but for the safety of everyone standing next to him. In decisive moments, when a long pass sailed into the air, Reed had to make a choice in a split second. No time for doubt, no chance to correct. That power made him special, but it also made him more and more alone. No one could truly understand what it felt like to carry an entire defense on your shoulders, to hold hundreds of worst-case scenarios in your head, and to live with the fear that one day your intelligence might lag half a beat. Reed rarely shared that, because he knew his role didn't allow public weakness. In Baltimore, he was seen as the symbol of certainty, of superhuman instinct. But behind that symbol was a man who isolated himself to keep everything from falling apart. Leading in silence meant there was no place to unload the burden. Reed couldn't step out of the defensive quarterback role even when the game ended. On those post-game nights, when his body ached, his mind kept rewinding every play, every decision, wondering if he'd missed anything. Success in Baltimore was tied to that quiet sacrifice, to Reed accepting a life where he was never fully allowed to let go. The tragedy of this phase wasn't in failure the Ravens won, and Reed was praised, but in the fact that those victories brought no release. The higher he climbed, the more locked he became in his role. He became the center of a historic defense, but he also became someone with no space to be himself off the field. No one carried the fear for him, because that fear itself was what kept the system running. And Ed Reed, in a Baltimore Ravens uniform, accepted that solitude as an inevitable part of power, understanding that for everyone else to be safe, some people had to carry the fear alone and never be allowed to fall. No one in the NFL got to the right spot as often as Ed Reed, and no one paid the price for that ability as quietly as he did. When people look back at those legendary interceptions, those root-cutting plays that seemed pre-programmed, they often call it instinct, gift, something that only happens to a select few. But the truth is far more tragic. Ed Reed didn't get to the right spot because of luck. He got there because he didn't allow himself to be wrong. Reed's ability to read the game didn't come from a single flash of brilliance. It came from a relentless, non-stop process where his mind was always half a second ahead of reality. He read offensive formations the way he read human faces, not just looking at positions, but at breathing patterns, the tiniest hesitations, the details others overlooked because they thought they didn't matter. For Reed, no detail was meaningless, because he'd learned from very early on that the things taken lightly were exactly where danger hid. Every time a quarterback shifted his eyes, every offbeat step by a wide receiver, every unusual pause before the snap, Reed registered it all and filed it into a bigger picture in his head. By the time the ball left the thrower's hand, Reed's decision had actually been made long before. That's why he always appeared in the right place, as if he knew what no one else did. But the price of always being half a second ahead of the world was never getting to live in rhythm with that world. Reed wasn't allowed to wait, wasn't allowed to react on pure instinct, because a slow reaction was a dangerous reaction. His mind was always out front, always predicting, always preparing for the worst-case scenario. That turned every game into an extended survival equation, with no real breaks, even when the clock was winding down. While others exhaled after a play, Reed had already started analyzing the next one. While others savored a moment of success, Reed wondered if he'd missed anything. That intelligence made him a legend, but it also gradually became chains binding him to a state of perpetual tension. Reed couldn't turn off his ability to read the game, because to him, it wasn't just a job skill, it was his way of existing. Even off the field, that habit followed him step by step. He scanned a room before entering, listened to the silence between words, and always kept a safe distance from the world around him. The biggest price of always getting to the right spot was never reaching a safe place in his own mind. Reed had no space to relax, because relaxing meant losing control, and losing control was something he'd been taught to avoid at all costs. The tragedy is that Reed's intelligence didn't bring freedom. It brought heavier responsibility. The more he understood the game, the more he realized how fragile it was. The more he read correctly, the more he knew that just one wrong read could ripple out like dominoes. So, success never built up into a feeling of safety. It only prolonged the state of vigilance. Reed lived in a stretched present, where the past wasn't enough to comfort and the future always held risk. Others could see art in the way he played, but only Reed felt the weight of that art. It was the art of always being ahead, always anticipating, always taking responsibility for what hadn't happened yet, and that art didn't allow him to stop. Ed Reed's tragedy wasn't that he had to think so much, it was that he didn't know how to stop thinking. The intelligence that once saved him from danger had now become a mental cage, keeping him in a state where he was never allowed to live slow. Reed got to the right spot on the football field, but in his inner life, he always stood at the door of safety without ever stepping through. And that very thing made his legend both brilliant and sad, because for the whole world to feel secure watching him play, Ed Reed had to trade away his own ability to feel secure in his life. No hit in Ed Reed's career was isolated, and no pain came and went like some random accident. They all accumulated, piled up, quietly wearing down a body that had lived on the edge of danger for too long. When outsiders looked at those route breaks, those ruthless, precise dives, they only saw the end result moment, while Reed felt the entire collision process in every muscle fiber, every joint, every part of the brain forced to absorb force that the human body was never designed to take. With every game that passed, his body logged one more layer of pain, not the kind that drops you instantly, but the kind that takes root and becomes the baseline for every movement afterward. Shoulders aching when he turned, back stiffening when he stood, neck feeling like it carried invisible weight, and headaches that arrived unannounced, then vanished, leaving a hard-to-name emptiness behind. Reed wasn't someone who didn't know pain. On the contrary, he understood his body's limits very clearly, clear enough to recognize when his body started begging to stop. But in the world he existed in, stopping wasn't an easy choice. Every time he stepped on the field, he carried the awareness that slowness didn't just endanger himself, it brought consequences for others. So Reed learned to negotiate with pain, treating it like background noise instead of a warning. Pain stopped being a reason to stop and became something to push through. Those early collisions, those helmet-rattling hits into opponents, didn't just leave physical scars, they planted the seed of a quiet dread, what was happening inside his head. Reed never publicly talked much about brain injuries, but he lived long enough in the NFL to understand that no hit was truly harmless. Every time his head got shaken was a time memories could get scrambled, reflexes could slow, and the sharpest weapon he'd ever had, his mind, could get dulled. For Reed, that was the deepest fear, not losing fame, but losing the ability to read the game. Losing the ability to stay half a second ahead of the world. The body could endure pain, but the mind wasn't allowed to slip a beat. The biggest tragedy of this phase wasn't that Reed got hurt because injuries are obvious in the NFL, but that he didn't allow himself to listen to his body. Every signal of fatigue got pushed down. Every ache got rationalized as an inevitable part of the role. Reed kept playing, not because he couldn't feel the breakdown, but because he feared what would happen if he stopped. Stopping meant admitting limits, and admitting limits meant breaking the image the whole system relied on. As seasons passed, Reed stepped onto the field with a heavier and heavier body, but his eyes kept that same ruthless focus. He knew every pain was stacking up, but he also knew that if he didn't hold his mind steady, everything he'd built would become fragile. That contradiction turned every game into an inner negotiation. The body demanded rest, the mind commanded continue, and in that unbalanced conversation, the mind always won. Reed didn't allow himself to collapse not because he was blindly tough, but because he saw no other option. In his position, weakness didn't just affect him. It could spread to the entire defense. So Reed accepted carrying pain as part of his professional identity. Mornings waking up with a body that felt locked stiff, headaches that came and went, moments when short-term memory got tested. All of it got bundled up and set aside, as if it wasn't important enough to interrupt the mission. But deep down, Reed understood the price was getting bigger. Every time he won a play with his mind and reflexes, his body took one more step toward exhaustion. Success kept coming, but so did irreversible wear. Ed Reed's tragedy wasn't that his body broke down, it was that he didn't allow himself to acknowledge it. His mind, forged from fear and responsibility, refused to accept stop signals. It kept pushing the body past limits, because for Reed, stopping wasn't rest, it was losing control. And in the world he'd lived in for decades, losing control was the most terrifying thing. So Reed kept stepping onto the field, kept playing through pain, kept carrying responsibility, until time itself forced him out of the game. But even when his body was no longer taking hits, the memory of those years stayed behind, like a bitter reminder that to keep others safe, Ed Reed had paid with his own body, and more importantly, with never allowing his mind to be permitted to fall. After all those collisions, the accumulated pain, and the years lived in a state where stopping wasn't allowed, family became the only emotional counterweight in Ed Reed's life. But it wasn't a place he turned to in order to escape the world. It was the place he feared the world touching the most. Reed never brought his family into the spotlight as part of his public image, never shared private stories to trade for sympathy or admiration. His silence wasn't coldness, it was absolute protection. Reed understood too well the price of attention, understood that fame didn't just bring applause, it dragged along scrutiny, pressure, and unrelenting expectations. So he built a hard boundary between the man on the football field and the man in family life. Not because he didn't value his achievements, but because he valued his family more than anything fame could offer. For Reed, family wasn't backdrop for a career. It was something fragile that needed shielding from that very career. He stayed away from the media not out of fear, but because he knew that even a tiny crack could let the outside world flood in and shatter the rare balance he'd worked so hard to preserve. Reed had spent his whole life controlling chaos on the field, but with his family, he chose to control by withdrawing. He didn't flaunt fatherhood moments, didn't tell everyday stories to build an image, because he believed some things only survive when they're not seen. The tragedy is that even in the space called the safest, Reed still never fully let his guard down. He didn't bring that vigilance into his family out of suspicion. He brought it out of fear of loss. Fear that the world which had taken his childhood, worn down his body and mind, could do the same to the people he loved if he didn't stand in front. Family became the place where he built his final defensive line, protecting it with silence, with speaking less, appearing less, and letting what was most precious live beyond the reach of public opinion. Reed didn't use family to heal, because he'd never allowed himself to think he needed healing. Instead, he treated family as the reason to keep upholding inner discipline, to keep living under control, to stay vigilant against anything that could disturb that fragile peace. In those rare moments not surrounded by the noise of the NFL, Reed found quiet with his family, but even that quiet was guarded carefully, like a small flame easily snuffed out by wind. He didn't let the world step into that space, because he knew once the boundary broke, it would be very hard to rebuild. Ed Reed's tragedy wasn't distance from his family. It was that he loved his family the way someone who's seen too much loss loves. He loved with defense, by always putting himself in front, ready to absorb the pressure for them. Family wasn't where he escaped a harsh life. It was the reason he kept shouldering that harshness alone. And in that choice, there was a deep sadness. Ed Reed protected his family by never allowing himself to live fully as a husband, a father unburdened by the shadow of the battlefield. He kept them at peace by keeping distance from the world, accepting that his love would always come with the fear of loss. Family became the one thing that scared Ed Reed more than fame, because fame could be traded, but family could not. That's why he chose silence, chose to stay away from the media, chose to stand in the shadows so the people he loved could live in ordinary light. That was the greatest emotional counterweight in his life, one that both saved him from complete emptiness and reminded him there were things worth protecting more than any glory, even if protecting them meant continuing to live in defense for the rest of his days. When Ed Reed left the field, that moment didn't bring the release people usually attach to the word retirement. It was simply the disappearance of the noise, and the silence that followed was the most frightening thing. No more collisions, no more helmets crashing at full speed, no more strategy meetings where his mind was allowed to run at full capacity. Ed Reed stepped into a void he'd never been prepared to face. On paper, he'd completed his career, paid the full price, elite sports demanded, walked away with his reputation intact. But inside, no off switch had been flipped. Vigilance didn't vanish just because the final whistle had blown. Reed no longer had specific enemies to read, no offensive formations to break down, no quarterbacks to track eyes before the snap, but the habit of living in defense stayed, like a reflex wired deep into his nervous system. He woke up without an alarm, mind still running, still scanning space, still searching for threats, in a world that seemed calm. The tragedy of this phase was the disconnect between reality and inner life. The outside world said he was safe now, nothing left to worry about. Life should be lighter. But Ed Reed didn't know how to live in that state. For decades, he'd existed by staying ahead of danger, by preparing for the worst. And when danger no longer had a clear shape, his mind didn't learn how to stop. No more opponents to confront, but the worry remained more vague, harder to name, and therefore harder to control. Reed didn't panic, didn't collapse publicly, didn't become a cautionary headline. He just moved slower on the outside while keeping the old tempo inside. The silence after retirement didn't bring peace. It exposed a void where the role that once defined him no longer existed. While playing, every tension had purpose. Every fear got channeled into action. Now, tension had nowhere to go. Fear had no target to face, and that forced Reed to confront himself in a way he'd never had to before. He was no longer shielded by game schedules, training discipline, the tight structure of an NFL season. Days no longer broke into clear tasks, and in that emptiness, Reed's mind kept doing what it knew best, staying vigilant. The tragedy wasn't that he missed the field, it was that he didn't know who he'd be without a field to focus all his worry on. Reed no longer had people to protect on the field, but the instinct to protect didn't disappear. It just turned inward, turning every thought into a loop, every silence into a space ripe for unease. On quiet nights, with no practice tomorrow, no game on the weekend, Reed realized the hardest enemy wasn't an opposing quarterback. It was the emptiness of a mind that had never been taught to rest. No one taught him how to live after he no longer had to always be right. No one prepared him for the moment when all eyes stopped following, but the inner responsibility stayed fully intact. Retirement, for Ed Reed, wasn't the end of the war. It was a dark shift to another form of fighting, where he no longer had specific opponents, only vague worry trailing every day. He kept living with discipline, kept avoiding the noise, kept a safe distance from the world, as if the game hadn't really ended. And in that prolonged silence, Reed slowly came to a bitter truth. Leaving the field didn't mean leaving the defensive state. For someone who'd lived too long by staying ahead of danger, peace didn't just appear because danger had changed shape. Ed Reed's tragedy after retirement wasn't losing glory. It was having to learn how to exist when the noise no longer covered the unease that had followed him his entire life. Bethune-Cookman appeared in Ed Reed's life, not as a job, but as a belated effort to fix what he'd lacked his entire life. A system that truly protected people before demanding they sacrifice. After retirement, when the noise of the NFL had died down, but the vigilance remained fully intact, Reed believed that if there was any place worthy of him placing his trust again, it had to be education, an environment where kids like the young him could be guided before being thrown into the survival war. Bethune-Cookman, a historically black college and university, represented that in Reed's mind, a chance to pass on the knowledge, discipline, and hard truths he'd had to learn through pain. He stepped into the leadership role not with ambitions of power, but with the familiar sense of responsibility, believing that if he stepped up to carry it, things could get better. But for the first time in his life, Ed Reed realized that vigilance and intelligence weren't enough to fix a system accustomed to stagnation. What he faced wasn't an opponent he could read ahead of time, wasn't a playbook he could break down. It was rigid structures, overlapping interests, and an indifference that had taken root too long. Reed spoke out about what he saw, not to shock, but because it was the only way he knew to protect those behind him. But this time, his straightforwardness wasn't celebrated. It was seen as a threat. The system didn't resist with direct confrontation. It resisted with silence, with delays, with making every effort to change so exhausting that the person stepping up had to withdraw on their own. The tragedy of Bethune-Cookman wasn't that Reed failed. It was that he came to a bitter truth. Not every place wants to be fixed, even when the fixing is necessary. Reed was used to carrying responsibility in silence, used to being the one ahead of danger. But here, the danger had no clear shape for him to confront. It was legitimized stagnation, fear of change hidden behind nice slogans. Reed didn't leave Bethune-Cookman in a burst of anger. He left with the exhaustion of someone who'd stared straight at his own limits. His ideals didn't shatter because he was weak. They shattered because, in many places, the world doesn't want to be shaken out of its familiar orbit. For Ed Reed, that was the most painful awakening fall, because for the first time, he couldn't protect others by shouldering the responsibility for them. He realized that some systems don't collapse from mistakes. They exist because people accept living with the mistakes. Bethune-Cookman forced Reed to face a question his entire career had never required him to answer. What happens when you're always right, but no one wants to hear it? The tragedy of this phase wasn't loud, no scorecard failure, just a quiet withdrawal, carrying a rare feeling of powerlessness. Reed had spent his life fixing mistakes before they happened, but this time he had to accept that not every battle could be won with intelligence and discipline. When he left, he carried not bitterness, but a deeper understanding of the world. There are places that don't lack people who see the problem. They just lack the will to change it. The fall at Bethune-Cookman didn't destroy Ed Reed, but it stripped away the last illusion that experience and good intentions are always enough to make a difference. And that very loss deepened the tragedy of maturity in his life, where every effort to give back something good had to face the risk of rejection. Not because it was wrong, but because it was too right for a world not ready to be fixed. The Hall of Fame came to Ed Reed like an exclamation point, placed very late at the end of a story that had already gone on too long. A moment the world believed finally closed everything neatly. When his name was called, when the gold jacket was draped over his shoulders, when the entire room stood and applauded, it was undeniable recognition that NFL history had once had a defensive back with such rare intelligence that he changed how people understood the game. But for Reed, that moment didn't bring the release outsiders imagined. It didn't erase the years lived in defense, didn't soothe the cracks that had formed deep inside him long ago. Standing on the podium, Reed didn't see the plays replayed on the big screen. He saw a long chain of seasons where he'd never been allowed to relax. He saw youth spent in vigilance, nights analyzing film instead of sleeping soundly, times when his body begged to stop, but his mind refused. The Hall of Fame gave him the ultimate acknowledgement, but it couldn't return what had been lost on the road to get there. Reed understood the value of that moment very clearly, understood that not everyone gets to stand there, but that understanding didn't mean he felt lighter. The honor didn't make the pains disappear, didn't fade the memories of the hits, and didn't change the fact that most of his life had been lived in a state of readiness for the worst. Reed didn't cry, didn't appear overwhelmed. He was too used to keeping himself in control. But inside, there was a heavy silence as he realized that even the absolute peak of his career couldn't compensate for the years he'd traded away. Achievement didn't return mornings waking up with a stiff body, didn't return moments when he chose discipline over ease, responsibility over lightness. Reed looked back at the path he'd walked and saw clearly that every title was built on the same foundation: non-stop vigilance. The Hall of Fame, in that moment, felt like a fake ending, a false resolution the world needed to believe the story was over, while for the man at the center, the story kept going. Reed didn't feel complete, didn't feel healed, because he understood that no honor could erase the habit of living in defense that had become instinct. When the stage lights dimmed, when the applause faded, he was still that same man, the one who'd lived too long by staying ahead of danger. The Hall of Fame recognized what he'd done for the game, but it couldn't intervene in what the game had done to him. Reed left the ceremony with his familiar quiet, not from lack of pride, but because he didn't find in it the liberation people always promise. The tragedy of that moment is that even when placed among the NFL's immortals, Ed Reed still carried cracks that could never be fully mended. He understood that his greatness was real, but the price he'd paid was just as real, and in that harsh balance, Reed accepted a bitter truth. Some achievements only prove you've endured long enough to be recognized. They don't mean you'll get back the parts of life that were lost. The Hall of Fame closed Ed Reed's career on paper, but in his mind, the years lived in defense were still there, quiet, persistent, like a reminder that glory can be immortal, but the cracks never fully disappear. Ed Reed today lives like a man who's stared at the world too long and no longer feels the need to prove anything to it. He walks slower, speaks less, appears less often, not because he fears the spotlight, but because he understands the price of standing under it for too long. After the Hall of Fame, there was no loud comeback, no victory tours, no need to have his name constantly invoked as a living icon. Reed chose silence not to disappear, but to keep for himself a rhythm of life he'd never had in 3 decades. His life is no longer measured by game schedules or whistles, but by days that pass without needing to brace for a hit from behind. But that quiet isn't complete peace. It feels like the state of a soldier who's left the battlefield but still hears echoes of old battles in his head. Reed isn't bitter, doesn't resent the game that made his name, because he never saw himself as a victim. He's just tired. Tired from living too long in a state of vigilance. Tired from carrying responsibility few truly understand. Tired because every step in life was once weighed as if it could lead to danger. Reed slows down not because of age, but because his mind needs time to catch up to a world that no longer demands he always be right. He appears less in public because he no longer needs validation, no longer has the drive to retell his story the way others want to hear it. What needed to be said, he said through action throughout his career. What needed to be proven, he proved with the price he paid. Now, Reed allows himself to exist without a role, even though that's not easy at all. There are days he still wakes up early, still scans the space around him like a habit he can't shake, still analyzes small details others ignore. But there are also days he sits still, letting time pass without needing to control it. The tragedy of this phase is that even after stepping out of the whirlwind of fame, Reed still hasn't fully escaped the person circumstances made him. He isn't angry at the world, doesn't blame the system, doesn't point fingers at the past. He just carries the deep exhaustion of someone who's seen too many sides of life. Glory and violence, trust and betrayal, recognition and solitude. Reed doesn't seek healing the way people usually talk about it, because he understands some cracks don't need to be sealed to disappear. They just need to be accepted so they no longer dictate every decision. He lives privately, avoids unnecessary debates, chooses few but lasting relationships, as if everything he keeps must be worth the energy he has left. No longer under pressure to protect an entire defense, Reed now protects himself by limiting what gets to enter his inner life. He doesn't seek recognition because he understands recognition doesn't bring rest. What he needs isn't praise. It's days that pass without being startled by old memories. Ed Reed's tragedy today isn't breakdown. It's the prolonged silence of a man accustomed to carrying loads. No big tragedy, no public fall, just the accumulated fatigue of someone who lived his role too completely. Reed walks through the world with the eyes of someone who understands not every battle needs to be won, and not every pain needs to be exposed. He doesn't vanish, he just steps back, far enough not to get pulled into the old loop. And in that stepping back, there's a very quiet, very human sadness. The sadness of a man who spent his life protecting others and now is learning to live without needing to stand in front anymore. When Ed Reed's story reaches its end, there's no moment for the world to stand and applaud again. No miracle to put every broken piece back in place. No explanation powerful enough to soothe everything that's built up over a lifetime. He isn't healed the way people tell stories about legends after the lights go out. No resurrection, no gentle rebirth to close every crack. Only a man who stood firm too long to fall in a loud way. Ed Reed doesn't walk out of his life as a fully victorious warrior. He walks out as a survivor, carrying the marks of everything he had to sacrifice to not collapse. For 30 years, he existed by splitting himself in two. One, half for the world, for responsibility, for the eyes that placed absolute trust in his ability to stay ahead of danger. The other half kept for himself, private, vigilant, never allowed to show fragility. There was never a moment Ed Reed was permitted to fully let go of that role, because letting go meant admitting everything he'd built could crumble. And so he chose to stand, not standing tall in glory, but standing steady in exhaustion. The ending of his life isn't liberation, it's acceptance. Acceptance that some wounds don't vanish just because time passes. Acceptance that habits formed from survival will follow you to the end. Acceptance that staying awake, for him, isn't some lofty state. It's the price paid, so everything around him doesn't fall apart. Ed Reed never allowed himself to sleep soundly completely, because sleeping soundly meant no longer keeping watch. He doesn't resent that, because he understands clearly what he chose and what he traded. No one forced him to become the one half a step ahead of danger, but life taught him that if he didn't, the price wouldn't be his alone. So he keeps living, not hoping for a day he'll be fully healed, but with the clear awareness that some cracks don't need to be sealed to still stand. America's star's signature isn't in tragic collapse, it's in this cold truth. Ed Reed didn't lose. He endured. No light at the end of the tunnel, only the ability to keep walking in the dark without losing himself. When everything ends, no more field, no more enemies to read, no more system to carry, Ed Reed still holds a strict inner order, as if that's the only way he knows to exist. He doesn't need pity, doesn't need more honors. All that's left is the truth that he lived his role completely, even though that role forced him to sacrifice so much no one saw. And in the silence of the present, Ed Reed stands as proof of a different kind of hero. Not the one who gets saved, but the one who learned to live with wounds without letting them swallow him. No miracle, no resurrection, no explanation. Just a man who paid the full price, who split himself in two so the world could be safer, and finally accepted that staying awake, in his life, it wasn't a gift. It was a form of sacrifice he carried to the very end. Ed Reed's story leaves a deep and quiet sadness, not because he failed, but because he paid so fully for his excellence. From the poor street, Rose, where childhood had no room for innocence, to Miami, where vigilance was celebrated but meant not allowed to be wrong, then to the Baltimore Ravens, where he became the defensive quarterback leading in silence, Ed Reed always lived in a defensive state. Those details show the tragedy wasn't in one single event, but in the accumulation of responsibility. Every correct read meant carrying fear for others. Every injury, every chronic pain was a reminder that his body begged to stop, but his mind wouldn't allow it. Even in retirement, the silence became more frightening than the noise, because he no longer had enemies to read, but the worry stayed. Bethune-Cookman marked the painful awakening. The ideal of giving back something good shattered not because he was weak, but because the system didn't want change. The Hall of Fame honored him, but didn't erase the cracks. Glory didn't return youth, health, or the ability to sleep soundly. For Americans, this story serves as an important reminder. Society often celebrates achievements while forgetting the human price paid. Success shouldn't be measured only by wins, but by whether we allow those who carry responsibility to rest, to be weak, to be human. Ed Reed is a model of discipline, awareness, and sacrifice, but also a warning that a strong nation doesn't just need people who are always right. It needs systems that protect them before they have to split themselves in two to survive. If Ed Reed's story made you pause and reflect on the quiet price behind glory, subscribe to the channel to keep joining us on these real journeys. Thank you for listening to the end, and see you in the next video, where we'll continue telling the quiet but deeply human stories behind America's legends.